Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Center of Faith and Work's Reimagining Work event focused on academics in Los Angeles. My name is Steve Lindsay, and I am the Executive Director of the Center for Faith and Work Los Angeles. And we exist to reframe people's lives and perspectives around their work and God's greater purposes for us in the flourishing of Los Angeles. This is the fifth in our series of Reimagining Work events where we focus in on a specific sector of work and seek out what is good and beautiful about that field of work and how we can be agents of redemption and restoration in light of the gospel. Higher education is well known to be one of the most influential sectors shaping culture and leadership of virtually every human institution. We've been looking forward to hosting this first event on academics for years and are very excited to bring a wonderful panel today, each of which is a scholar in their own right, a leader, and a seasoned practitioner in their field. We have interest in who we're interacting with today. So we have an opportunity to do a quick poll of the folks that are joining us today. So I'm going to have, this is going to pop up for you on your screen. I'm going to ask that everybody that's in attendance just do a quick answer to the questions listed. It's a short multiple choice, so it should not take more than about 20 or 30 seconds. And then we will share the answers with you as they populate. And you'll get to see the results. I can see they're coming in fast and filling up quick. As soon as they slow down, I will just go ahead and share the results. Well, it's looking like we have a really broad, diverse group of pretty good balance, favoring on the academic roles, favoring professors, which is ideal for this event. But we also have administrators, researchers, teachers, and students, and a smattering of folks not in academics of general interest. As far as the type of institution you've been involved in, we have kind of an even split between public and private, and then a smaller group of about 8% in private Christian. And then we have the categories are well distributed between the STEM fields, humanities, and business. And then about 8% in law and government as well. So that's great. That is very useful for our panel and moderator today. So we really appreciate you sharing that with us. So with that, I'm going to introduce our moderator for today. We have a very good friend, Robert Cavallo, who is somewhat of a cultural theologian, is the way he's been best described, residing in Los Angeles. He recently authored, and we actually spotlighted his work on a book titled Fashion Theology. Robert also serves as a scholar at the Visual Faith Institute of Art and Architecture. He served as a faculty at Biola University's Torrey Honors Institute and currently directs the Center for Pastoral Residence at Christ Church in Sierra Madre. So I'm going to let Robert take it from here. Welcome, Robert.
Hey, thanks, Steve. I'm really excited about our time together today. You know, faith has played a major role in academics, and the idea that you can approach the various fields of knowledge as part of a full perspective, you know, the idea that you can take up knowledge and understand it from the vantage point of what Charles Taylor calls a comprehensive perspective, all the different disciplines comprehensively, you know, already invokes the idea of faith, because of course, the faiths of the world offer a comprehensive perspective, and Christianity in particular from its inception has been a thinking faith. It has held from the beginning that there are certain things that are true about the world. There are certain beliefs that need to be interrogated. And we think of the writer of the Gospel of Luke approaching the subject matter of Jesus and all of his teachings as something that can be verified and should be verified, which I think is quite remarkable. Of course, this doesn't mean that Christianity has always sat easily with various theories of knowledge that have popped up and various ways the university has been configured in various canons of knowledge and all of that. But it has nevertheless been very important in the history of academics, and the Christian faith has promoted higher education very early. Even we think about the apologists that emerged early on, the philosophers that that converted to Christianity and then would use their philosophy in order to defend the faith. So Christianity has played a remarkable role in the academy and the establishment of universities around the world. So today's event, Reimagining Work in the Academy, is very fitting as a subject that the Center for Faith and Work in LA desires to bring forth, because we want to understand the role of academic work from a Christian perspective. And specifically, we want to understand how to be a Christian in the academy and how to promote human flourishing and the renewal of the academy from the Christian perspective and as Christians. And everyone involved in this event is simply, of course, stating their option. They're not representing the institutions they work in, but they are going to bring their personal wisdom and their own experience as those who are professors and working within the academy and very esteemed people within their academy as well. So here's what we're going to do. We are going to meet our panel one by one. So I will introduce them. And then after that, we will have a time of Q&A. So I want to ask everybody participating, feel free to be posting as people are talking, and we will come to those questions that you post in the Q&A feature at the end of our time together. So with no further ado, I would like to begin by introducing our first panelist, who is Brian Greger. Brian is an associate professor of philosophy at Cal State Dominguez Hills. He's the author of multiple books, including The Cross Before Me, and he's the president of the Society of Recours Studies. As someone that's enjoyed Recours myself, I was happy to hear that, Brian. Brian, much of your work in the academy has centered around the question of self-identity, a huge subject today, and approaching that from a Christian perspective is something you've done. So I'm very curious what drew you to this area of study, and what have you discovered and applied from your own research?
Thanks, Robert. Yeah, I think my first philosophy course when I was a freshman, first semester, I encountered some of the big metaphysical questions like the relation between mind and body and the nature of personal identity, free will, human agency, those kinds of questions that would fall within the domain that's known as philosophical anthropology. So like the theory of what it is to be human, what it means to be a human being. So that always sort of jumped out at me. And then especially as a Christian, thinking about those questions philosophically in light of the idea that we're made in God's image and how to understand that. And those questions are really at the root of so many of the questions in our present cultural moment. What is a human being is at the root of a lot of our big debates about what it is to flourish and what the common good is, how we should live together. So those have always really been central for me. And then I think also just the existential questions of the self, like ever since I was a kid, I was always fascinated by the fact that humans have this sort of first-person perspective, this unique individual point of view, and kind of understanding what that means in the nature of our experience. And so the question of the self was always intriguing to me for that reason. And one way to think about that, if talk about the self seems kind of abstract, is I'm talking about it in the sense of, how do we know who we are? That's one of the basic questions that we ask as human beings. Who am I? How do we answer that question? Who am I? Who are we? And so I'm interested in the way that people have tried to answer that question over the centuries, and different philosophers and different religious traditions, but especially Christianity, and how it is that we know who we are in relation to God in particular. So I've written a fair bit on that, in particular, what the cross tells us about who we are, how God shows himself to us, and what the cross tells us about what it means to be human. And so some of the thinkers that I've worked on in that area would be Soren Kierkegaard, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and Paul Ricoeur, as you mentioned, all thinkers that have really great insights into the nature of the self, or the human person. One of the things that I think might be helpful for us just to kind of grab onto in this context today is Kierkegaard's idea that the self is both a gift and a task. Because that idea that the self is a gift and it's a task, those ideas, that helps to challenge a lot of the assumptions that are prevalent in our culture that I think need to be challenged. So if we think that the self is a gift, in some way it's given to us by God, that challenges some of our prevailing assumptions about how one becomes a self. That I'm not simply what I make of myself. That's a very common idea, that we make ourselves, we decide who we are going to be. And also the idea that we belong to ourselves. George McDonald, the fantasy writer, has a famous line in one of his sermons where he says that I am my own is the one principle of hell. And yet that's kind of a common assumption. I had a student once who said, we were talking about these ideas, and the idea that in some way we're accountable to God for who we are was repulsive to her. And she said, hands off, God. And I thought that really got to the heart of it. So this idea that the self is a gift, in some ways given by God, that's something that needs deep philosophical reflection. And then at the same time, the idea that the self is also a task is important to think through, because it means that formation matters. The self is in some way, according to Kierkegaard, always becoming. It's in a process of development that we work out in relation to God and in relation to others. And that means that the self isn't just something that's kind of hidden inside of us somewhere. That's another common idea, that the true self is somehow this deep mystery that we all have inside, and somehow we have to figure out what that is, and to find what the true self is. But the self isn't really something we have in that kind of way, that it's just there. Robert mentioned Charles Taylor earlier, and Taylor has a great line about the self, where he says that a lot of people assume the self is something we have the way we have maybe a liver and a heart, or it's just this interpretation free given. It's just this thing that's just kind of there. But the self is a task that is ongoing in its development, and in order to know who we're supposed to be, we need that revelation from God. If I can close with one more quotation. I'm dropping lots of names here, so whose name is better to drop than St. Augustine? He says in his Confessions, to hear you speaking about oneself, to hear God speaking about oneself, is to know the truth about oneself. And so we know who we are through God's word, what God tells us about ourselves. So my philosophical work in sum is a reflection on those ideas, that we know who we are in relation to God, and then that has implications for all these other areas, thinking through them philosophically.
Wow, we have a lot to talk about, Brian. That's fascinating. And I was busy taking notes on the side while you were talking, because I was so stirred by these insights about the self. So thank you. We look forward to some Q&A on later on these subjects. Next, we have on our panel Francis Su. Francis is the Benedictson Karwa, I hope I got that right, Francis. Benedictson Karwa, professor of mathematics at Harvey Mudd College. He served for 2 years as president of the Mathematical Association of America. And he's the author of a book, Mathematics for Human Flourishing. I actually had a chance to take a look at this, Francis. Wonderful book talking about various virtues and the relationship to mathematics that just came out. Francis, it's so good to have you with us. I have a question for you. You know, the opening pages of the Bible speak of God's intention to see humanity flourish in all aspects of life. In what ways did the biblical truth inspire your work on your latest book, Mathematics for Human Flourishing?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, in some ways, one of the things I think as academics, it's very easy to do is for us to compartmentalize our work and to see it as somehow over here and the rest of our life over here. And so one of the things that I have been thinking about for a long time, and it shows up in many ways in the book, is thinking about the integration. This ties in, of course, directly with the center, the integration of my whole life, you know, my academic life, the things that I'm studying with the things that that matter to me as a human being. And so the book is really, in some ways, a book about what it means to be human through the lens of mathematics. And you know, if you want to talk about what it means to be a human being, you really can't do that without touching on themes of spiritual significance. So one of the ways in which I think biblical ideas and truth informs the book is one of the central stories in the book is a story of redemption. It's a story of a prison inmate that I've had a long correspondence with over mathematics, but also about life. And so that's, you know, over the course of the book, you begin to see his transformation because of the deep study and the pursuit of knowledge. In many of the themes that I talk about are themes that are both human themes, but also very spiritual themes. Talking about justice, what does it mean to be just? Talking about what truth is, and of course, in mathematics, truth is something that you're seeking to uncover, right? You're seeking to uncover the unseen patterns of the world, and so, you know, in some ways, I try to touch, although I'm not a philosopher, I'm sort of an armchair philosopher. I start asking some bigger questions about what is truth and how do we know it. The idea of play is really important in mathematics, but it's also important, I think, from a spiritual perspective. The idea that there's some ideas that are eternal, that's something, you know, in many ways, people who pursue mathematics are often awed by some of the things that are, in some ways, feel very like a religious pursuit, right? The eternal, the infinite, these are all big themes in mathematics. The idea of encountering something that's really beautiful. These are things that I think touch on deeply what it means to be a human being. And of course, in math, we often see truths that cause us to just, you know, jaw-dropping truths that cause us to go, wow, that's amazing. And so part of what I'm hoping to do in starting the dialogue is asking how many of these deep human desires lead us to or point to maybe deeper truths. I'm reminded of what C.S. Lewis talked about in thinking about transcendence, that, you know, there's this idea of the scent of a flower we haven't found, the echo of a tune we haven't heard. I think that's the way he put it. And that's often the kind of thing you experience when you see and you uncover mathematical truths, is like you say, whoa, I think there's something deeper going on here, even though we don't know what it is. And then finally, I'd say love is a big theme in the ideas of the book, and the idea of unconditional love, right? So too often, math is seen as a way of separating ourselves from other people, right? Distinguishing the elite from the non-elite. And I totally take a different approach in thinking about, well, what does it mean to love somebody through and because of mathematics unconditionally? And you know, if you think about math as something you do to flourish, it's a very different view than thinking about doing math in order to credential yourself. And of course, if you think about it as flourishing, and of course you'll want to you hope that you would approach everybody um, unconditionally as somebody worthy of seeing some of the beauty that lies within mathematics. Yeah, so there are many, I guess, many themes, and maybe even the as you pointed out, there's a lot of discussion of what virtue is in the book, and how cultivating good practices in the way we think about and teach mathematics is important.
I have to say, I think the book really sets a model for how to think integratively as a Christian. And I think you wouldn't even need to care much about math and just gain so much from the book. So I really enjoy your work. And I love the redemptive theme as you're interacting with the prisoner. So thank you, Francis. Look forward to interacting more in the Q&A with any questions we have. Next up, we have Leanne Nguyen, and Leanne is a non-invasive cardiologist and an assistant professor of medicine at UCLA. She serves as a co-chair of the Christian Academic Physicians and Scientists, which is a subspecialty section of the Christian Medical and Dental Association. And Leanne, there can be a tendency for Christians to flee service and education in the academy in light of growing Western secularization. Why is that, Leanne? And what Christian distinctives might be lost if believers disengage from participation in the university space? Can you tell us a little bit more of your thoughts on that?
Sure, of course. Thank you, Robert and Steve, for inviting me to be involved in this session this morning. To answer your question, Robert, about the tendency for Christians to flee service and education, in general, medicine has become more complex, and academic medicine even more particular. As medicine evolves, certain clinical practices conflict with the overall Christian worldview, and that makes it challenging for daily practice. Moreover, and even more important, I would say, that as secularization and corporatization take a strong foothold in academic medicine, there is a loss of Christian principles that are at the heart of medical care and hospitality. And it is this loss of core principles that has led to disenchantment of many Christian physicians and scientists who typically serve in the academy. Moreover, additionally, I think there are few resources for Christian academic physicians and scientists. CMDA in the past year has worked to fill this void with the CAP section, and their goal is to equip and to provide fellowship for Christian academic physicians and scientists. They host monthly webinars on relevant topics and have been working to build a network of small discipling groups whose goal is to facilitate faith fellowship in academic medicine. CFWLA has also sponsored an event that's geared towards supporting physicians. And I know personally that I and many of the physicians who participated were grateful to Steve for this effort. Now, in regards to the other part of your question about what Christian distinctives might be lost if believers disengage from the university or from academic medicine, I think the biggest loss really is we lose out on the opportunity to be salt and light. As academic physicians and scientists, not only do our activities impact the lives of our patients through the care of our patients, through our research discoveries, but our work as faculty also affects countless students, trainees, and colleagues. And then they in turn go and affect hundreds of lives later on. So in essence, when we disengage, we forfeit meaningful opportunities to serve as witness to God's work. I feel very fortunate to be able to serve in the capacity as a physician to care for each of my patients and to also share my research with the community. And so if there aren't many Christian physicians and researchers in the academy, we lose out on these opportunities to witness, to serve God, really.
Thank you, Leanne. I really appreciate your response to that. And finally, on our panel, we have Jeff Hanson. And Jeff is a research associate in philosophy at Harvard and senior philosopher for their Human Flourishing program. Jeff, the goal of academics in its creation was to understand God's creation and to see each facet fit together under his lordship. But today, university spaces often have many subsets of studies with job placement or knowledge pursuit as their main goals. With this in view, how does your faith inspire your own work in the Human Flourishing program to promote unity in the university space for the common good? That's a mouthful question, but I'm gonna pass that one to you, Jeff.
I would like to start actually answering your very good question just by turning back to actually an historic precedent. And you spoke in your question about the goal of academics as being an ambition to understand God's creation being gathered together amongst many facets under the lordship of Christ. And I want to talk just for a few minutes in the hope that listeners will find this interesting about the vision of Hugh of St. Victor, who was a 12th century theologian and wrote an intriguing text called the Didascalicon, which is subtitled On the Study of Reading. So this text is often understood to be a kind of treatise on the organization of the diverse fields of learning that were engaged by what was then one of the most advanced centers of learning in Europe, the Abbey School of St. Victor in Paris, which is where Hugh was working as a teacher. But it's actually more than that, I think. I think the book is more than a merely technical or pedagogical text. Commentators have noticed that the Latin word that we translate as study, when Hugh talks about the study of reading, that word really means something more like zeal. For Hugh, the study of reading is not just a delimited area of inquiry, but it's a kind of lifelong dedication to learning. And he thought of reading as the sort of controlling metaphor for how we go about acquiring wisdom. Now, Hugh thought that the purpose of learning was certainly not just the acquisition of information or something like training for employment, which, as your question points out, is really the way we tend to think of formal education now. But for him, the point of education was to grasp wisdom itself. And for Hugh, wisdom is just another name for the mind of Christ. So for him, to study is to learn to read, as it were, the mind of Christ, the word of God by whom all things were created and in whom all human knowledge finds its meaning and purpose. So Hugh affirms the value of the 7 liberal arts, which by the time he was writing had really attained a kind of canonical status in the West. And those 7 are grammar, rhetoric, dialectic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. And we can talk more about those later if people are interested. But Hugh makes a famous innovation on this curriculum by adding a parallel 7 arts that he calls mechanical. And these are more practical pursuits. He calls them fabric making, armament, commerce, agriculture, hunting, medicine, and theatrics. So like the liberal arts, he divides these into 2 groups, one of which he says concern external things, the sciences that pertain to how we create protection for ourselves from harms. And he says that's fabric making, armament, and commerce. And there's another group that he calls the 4 internal arts by which we feed and nourish ourselves. And those are agriculture, hunting, medicine, and theatrics. So each of these categories is actually quite broad, right? So when Hugh talks about armament, he means not just weapons or something like that, but he talks about house building. And hunting also includes cooking and baking. And theater is a sort of shorthand for all kinds of entertainment. The important thing about this, I think, is not so much his inclusion of the specific mechanical arts, but the way in which he assigns a role to even these pursuits in a kind of overall project. So Hugh says at one point, I'm going to quote him here, he says, "This then is what the arts are concerned with. This is what they intend, namely to restore within us the divine likeness, a likeness which to us is a form, but to God is his nature. The more we are conformed to the divine nature, the more do we possess wisdom, for then there begins to shine forth again in us what has forever existed in the divine pattern or idea, coming and going in us, but standing changeless in God." So for Hugh, education is a theoretical enterprise in that it secures wisdom. It's practical in that it can actually promote virtue, and it's useful in that it repairs the defects to which our bodily natures are subject as a result of the fall. So wisdom for him is ultimately about restoring us to our created perfection. It's about bringing us back to an understanding of who we are as human beings by improving our ability to act virtuously and by supplying us with what we need to flourish and survive in a fallen world. So the vision here is of education as redemptive, right? It's about recovering what's been lost in the fall and recovering insight into the mind of Christ. And that happens even in the lowly mechanical arts, things like hunting and cooking and medicine. These are things that have not necessarily been historically held in high esteem by learned Westerners, but everything has a place within Hugh's schematism of the one whole and complete divine wisdom. So your question is speaking, I think, about people like Hugh and about the way they thought about education. And I still find his picture as something of inspiration, even though his own educational program was never really very widely implemented in Western history. The university, as it developed, went in very different directions, eventually ending up in the modern research university that we know today, which has a sort of siloed collection of individual areas of specialization. And we're very familiar with that, and we frequently lament that state of affairs. So my own faith leads me to believe that we can, however, overcome some institutional divisions in favor of an appreciation for wisdom itself, right, for the mind of Christ itself, even when that mind is refracted across different areas of understanding and thinking. Now, I'm not a spokesperson for the Human Flourishing program or for Harvard University. I'm speaking for myself as a scholar, and the Human Flourishing program is itself non-sectarian, but we are methodologically committed in our work to overcoming divisions within the fields of knowledge. And we're ultimately interested in sort of very big and broad epistemological questions, like what exactly do we know about human being and how can we know it? And we're convinced that these big questions can't really be answered by any one discipline exclusively, which is why we draw on philosophy and social sciences like psychology and sociology. That's our whole purpose for being, is to get these conversations to happen with each other rather than in parallel. So I'm fond of talking about this relationship as a kind of two-way street, right? So many of our research projects in psychology and sociology tend to shy away from even trying to investigate deep human issues like love or meaningfulness or forgiveness, because there seems to be some kind of widespread attitude that such matters lie outside the realm of what's knowable for empirical investigation. And when such projects are undertaken, they often bring to their investigation very shallow or unquestioned or uncritical suppositions. So part of our project at the Human Flourishing program is to strengthen these inquiries by sharpening the questions that empirical researchers pose and trying to deepen the way they think about significant human phenomena. But it is a two-way street, right? So we also expect that empirical research will offer a corrective to philosophical speculation. And we take it that empirical data are a kind of evidence that can help confirm or disconfirm philosophical theories. So we aim not just to study human flourishing as a matter of abstract theoretical interest, but we also are looking to practically promote it. And this is another area where I think we're trying to recover something of that unity that your question speaks about. It's not just a theoretical undertaking, but it's an actual practical effort to make people's lives better. So as I've said, our hope is first to revolutionize the study of human being by fortifying those epistemological foundations of the social sciences, which in some ways are in crisis today. But we also want to make a discernible impact on how human flourishing is promoted by changing that knowledge base in such a way as to guide actual policy and practice.
Thanks, Jeff. Wow, Hugh of St. Victor was really thinking in comprehensive ways and interesting ways way back in the day. And it sounds like you're doing some fascinating stuff there at Harvard. We have now had an introduction to all four panelists, and this is where we move to our Q&A part of our time together this morning. And we have had already one question pop up in the Q&A. If you have a question, this would be a good time for you to turn to the Q&A feature and go ahead and raise that question. And but I want to start off with a question for all of our panelists, and we can go ahead and just turn on all of our videos at this time. And the question is this: how does your work as a Christian in academics contribute to God's glory and the common good? So kind of a more general softball question to get us going.
I guess I'll take a shot at that. I guess one way that I think about this is when I think about all I guess the adage that all truth is God's truth, and uncovering truth then is sort of an opportunity to see something about God's creation, God's nature. And so even as I help other people see some of these truths, mathematical truths, even if they don't attribute it to the action of a divine being, it can be a pointer to God, right? People can experience wonder, they can experience awe, transcendence. And then the second thing I would say is that the work that we do is not just the results themselves, but encouraging redemptive practices in our disciplines. And that's one way, a very important way that we contribute to the common good, right? Thinking about how our work is carried out in and among a community of people, but also how it's used. I think a little bit about how, there's a lot of discussion these days about how algorithms are used in nefarious ways to categorize and track people, right? So that's an example of a mathematical product that we need to think carefully about and how it's used in the world. And these are ways that I think we contribute as believers to the common good.
I'd like to add a little bit to Francis's comment in the sense that I'm in a unique position as a physician and also as a researcher. As a physician, I'm able to provide care, personal care, and to be there for my patients at a time when they are ill, or to really witness their humanity and God's grace, and to journey through them and to be God's handmaiden. So in that sense, it's not only practical through medicine or providing medical care, but through teaching and research, I think it is also living out the gifts that I have been given to influence, to shepherd my students and my trainees in a path, or to engage them and encourage them to ask questions about the world that they live in, and encourage them to explore and approach how they live out their lives and what they may want to use their talents for going forward. I think that's the uniqueness of being an academic physician. And then moreover, as I conduct my research, God has created this fantastic world, and as a scientist, I'm able to use some of the gifts to discover, to explain what has already been created. So in essence, the story of creation and evolution are not two separate things, but in fact, these things fit together in a very nice big puzzle, if we want to put it that way. And I think that really is part of the reason why we'd like to, that Christians really should not leave the academic ivory tower.
If I could add to that as well, I approach my scholarship, my publishing a little differently from the way I teach in the classroom, and I see both of those as different ways of being a Christian philosopher. So when I'm writing things for publication, I try to make the best arguments I can make on whatever topic I'm writing on, and I tend to do that more from an explicitly Christian perspective. I mean, my dissertation being on the cross, for instance, like that was an explicitly Christian argument, whereas in the classroom, I think it's important, and kind of going along with what Francis is saying, not to come in there and always be arguing from an explicitly Christian perspective, because I think it's important for the students to see what careful philosophical work looks like across the board. And it's easy, I think there's a tendency in the academy for faculty to feel like this is my soapbox, so I need to tell people what I think politically or religiously or whatever. And I don't think it's fair in that position to use that platform in that way, because I'm have more of a Socratic approach of trying to teach the students to think and to think through these questions in a way that's honest and fair. And I think that is also reflecting something of the way God's made us, with the capacity to reason, to think through things and to discuss. And so then, whoever I'm teaching, whatever authors I'm teaching, I try to present them as fairly as possible. And then I feel like when I get to Christian authors, I've maybe more earned the right to present them at their full strength as well, rather than, these people are stupid, I don't agree with them, and now here's the truth. Because students pick up on that very quickly, and it doesn't really teach them how to do good philosophy. And I think God cares about doing good philosophy. So in one of my courses that I've been teaching the last few years, it's called The Good Life. I go through different theories of the good life from antiquity, looking at the Epicureans and Stoics. And at the end of the semester, I ask the students to present on the different schools and try to make arguments for those, why people should be, say, a Stoic or an Epicurean. And last year, one of the students at the end of the semester wanted to know, well, what do you think is the best school? And I was happy that they didn't know what I thought at the end of the semester. So then I was able to say in that last meeting, actually, Christianity. I'm a Christian. And I heard them gasp, whoa. And I explained why I thought that gave a better account of the good life. And so that, experiences like that kind of confirm that sense that I think it's worth it to be patient and not rush ahead to, giving what you think are the answers, but to take the long route of helping them think through things that way.
That's fascinating. I like what you're saying, Brian, and it seems like there's just a way of glorifying God just by doing your discipline well. Being an academic that takes your focus and your subject matter serious as part of the world that God made, and approaching it with integrity, and approaching the classroom with integrity as a public space, not as a soapbox in which you've been employed to in order to educate. And so I hear that kind of theme coming through. And that doesn't mean we leave our Christianity outside of a public space, but it also means that we don't use that public space kind of in a self-serving way, just as a, as a soapbox. I really appreciate that. I'm curious if anybody else had any more thoughts on that initial question before I give us another one.
I might just say that I appreciate what you said, Brian, as well. And I feel like when I was doing more classroom teaching, that was my kind of policy and approach also. I was always pleased when students didn't really know who my favorite philosophers were at the end of the year, right? So I think I second that. And I'll say something else, just because I don't do any classroom teaching. I have an unusual position I am in the academic world, but I'm not part of a regular department of philosophy or something like that. And part of what's been interesting for me to kind of discover is confronting just a whole new set of challenges and problems that don't belong to my discipline. I mean, so some of the interesting work the Human Flourishing program has done in the last couple of years has been to demonstrate with increasingly significant sort of piles of proof and evidence that regular religious service attendance has an impact, a very positive impact on various aspects of mental health, most especially on warding off depression and suicide. And that was an interesting discovery for me, in part because it's the sort of thing you would hope as a person of faith you might be able to discover, right? You would be inclined to sort of want to see that. And the fact that we can actually develop evidence for it is really a function of wanting to, right? Or even posing for yourself the challenge, right? So I feel like sometimes, I look back to Alvin Plantinga's old essay on advice to a Christian philosopher, in which, part of his message there was to say, if you're philosophically interested in something because of your faith, that shouldn't be a reason not to pursue it, right? And as for you in your case, right, pursuing sort of the Christological, right, and sort of cruciform aspects of selfhood, that was something that mattered to you, right? And that it formed the heart of your dissertation because it was something that your faith sort of inspired within you to investigate further, right? Which you can then do in a philosophically credible way. And I feel like sometimes some of the research that we've done has been undertaken in a similar spirit, right? And that, if you were, say, entirely skeptical about the potential benefits on mental health of regular religious service attendance, you wouldn't pick up this topic for investigation at all. But right, having been interested in that, we've made some fascinating discoveries and some very important discoveries about how significant that can be in a person's well-being. And as a result, we've actually added to the body of empirical knowledge, right, about maybe even a technical problem within empirical social science, which has existed for a while, which is what is the best way to measure religiosity at all, right? And that's been a sort of a confused question, right? Because it's not clear how best to even assess what it means for a person to say they're religious. And what we're finding is that sort of the most impact, right, that seems to be measurable comes from regular service attendance as a proxy for religiosity. It has much greater influence than, say, something like self-reported practices of prayer or meditation, or self-reported spirituality or something like that. So, I think that the lesson here is to sort of pursue things that you find interesting and important, but do so in such a way that you may actually make a difference to the evidence base, or make a difference to sort of how people perceive the questions that you're pursuing and the answers to them.
And if we might even tie it all together, back with, I was thinking of Leanne's just kind of heart that really came out when she was talking about how she practices medicine. It seems like the hermeneutic of love, if indeed the chief virtue of Christianity is love, the hermeneutic of love really shapes the way in which scholarship is practiced. And I saw this also, Francis, in your book. Just, I mean, I never would have attached mathematics to love, but this redemptive story that unfolds, and in fact, you attempting to show mathematicians that there is good that you can do in the world by virtue of mathematics, and so it seems like maybe this is I'm sure that there's an awful lot that's been written, or maybe work that's being done about the importance of love as a key facet of what it means to be a Christian scholar in the academy, and maybe something that we haven't really spent enough time reflecting on. Though I hear that theme operating from all of you, and I think that's wonderful. I do want to throw another question out here, and then we have some questions that have come in as well. What are some of the challenges? I mean, let's be honest. There's some serious challenges being a Christian and living out your faith as an academic. So what are some of the challenges and complexities of living out your faith in the world of academics?
I'll just mention two, I think, that come to mind. I mean, one is compartmentalization, which I think I've referred to a little bit earlier, sort of how easy it is to disconnect my faith life from the work that I do, and me always being mindful and thinking about how they inform each other. And the other is nuance, maybe. I mean, I think it's easy for academics to pigeonhole Christians, and so but it's also actually easy for Christians to pigeonhole academics, right? So we're sort of living in an in-between world where we have to communicate to both Christians as well as academics who we are and what we do in ways that I think are more nuanced than it may first appear.
Yeah, I think that sense of being in these different communities, being in the academy and also being in church communities, especially just related to what Jeff was saying as well. I think as a Christian academic, it's important to maintain that connection to a church community because the academy, in a lot of ways, at least my experience of the academy now where I work, there's a sense in which it's trying to provide a comprehensive kind of vision of the good life and justice and things like that. And it's easy, I think, to be really kind of persuaded by a lot of that because that's what you're working in and that's what all your colleagues are talking about. And so I think as a Christian, it's important to maintain your primary community in a church body. where your formation's really happening, so that you can actually, like Leanne said, be salt and light. If it's pretty easy to lose your saltiness in the academy if you're not, deeply connected to, the church body.
I think what Brian said is so important, to be connected with a community. And I found that in recent years, and as a young academic faculty member, I find that to be so crucial in my journey. In academic medicine, the challenge, I think, for a Christian is how do we engage our colleagues, our trainees, our students in a winsome way, so as not to offend, but to maintain a firm, grounded reason for our hope and our faith, not to give way or to use fluffy reasons to justify or explain our belief and why we have hope. That is the biggest challenge, at least I have found. And what Brian has said is crucial, because having that community gives you or lends you the strength and the courage and the words to be able to express the reason for hope and the reason for faith.
I mean, I've spoken about how exciting and I think and how important some of our recent research has been. Not everybody finds it that. I think there are real resistances to some of what the work that Christian scholars might do and might produce. And certainly, just to continue with the same example of some of our recent scholarship, no matter how well evidenced it is, there are some people who don't want to countenance the theory that regular religious service attendance might have a positive impact on mental health. I mean, it wasn't so long ago that the only sort of prevailing psychological theories about religiosity is that it was necessarily neurotic and therefore harmful to mental health, right? So, there's the suggestion that somehow participation in religious life, might have a positive impact on mental health is one that is not welcome in every quarter, and that some people will seek to explain away by other means. We have mathematics to help us on that front, actually, but nevertheless, I mean, it's not necessarily completely welcome across the board, and there are certain institutional barriers, I would say, or forms of resistance. I mean, among them, just quite simply structural. I mean, I was a co-author on a piece recently published in Frontiers in Psychology that was about forgiveness, and particularly about self-forgiveness. And the extent of my contribution really was just to sort of make a few sentences about Kierkegaard's view of self-forgiveness, which I think is an important and interesting one. But the very constraints under which social science publication has to happen affords, say, a literal hard word count as to how many words you can include on, say, philosophical backdrop, for a particular study. So it's very regimented, and it's very, difficult to sort of see how you would develop, say, a philosophical foundation or inspiration within that kind of straitjacketed sort of formulaic way of publishing. By the same token, I would say, I found it difficult to find a philosophy journal that would publish an article in which I'm drawing heavily on social science research to, say, combat some philosophical point of view or to refute, some theory. The institutional barriers are significant in that, the places, say, where a person can publish, how a person can publish, how much one can include in a publication, what kinds of things a person could include in a publication. Those are sometimes seemingly insurmountable.
And I hear you, Jeff. I hear the word courage behind what you're talking about. In that, it sounds like that there's going to be challenges to respond with respect and integrity, but also not lose your voice in the midst of the cacophony of voices that are in the academy. And maybe something, Brian, I hear you saying also is the need not to lose our distinctiveness and be okay with thinking as Christians, but also recognize in a very self-critical way that this is not the only way to think, and constantly that I mean, maybe that's like a virtue to be able to demonstrate that capacity to be both kind of first person considerations and then third person considerations, stepping outside of yourself and having that kind of humility. As maybe humility is another kind of theme we should bring in here as well, in terms of like being a knower. So I've really enjoyed this, and we still have a little bit of time to answer a few more questions and hear from our panelists. We have a question coming in from David. He asks, what are ways that the panelists recommend sparking a deep integration of faith and academics and fellow faculty colleagues and students, both within our own disciplines and across the academy? Thank you for that question, David. Panelists. Let me ask it one more time. What are ways that the panelists recommend sparking a deep integration of faith and academics and fellow faculty, colleagues, and students, both within our own disciplines and across the academy?
In some ways, I think it has to do with a combination of what Brian, Francis, and Jeff have said. I think is being the best that we can possibly be within our own discipline, conducting our research and our teaching with rigor, reproducibility, acting with integrity, and engaging our colleagues in a way that challenges them to ask questions, but at the same time, I guess, admit humility that sometimes our scholarship can't explain everything, and at other times there has to be room, and Tim Keller does this very well in engaging Christians across all fields. And when I think about that question, I really do think Tim Keller and his approach and his actions have really come to mind as how academics can really use their scholarship to display and to act and to be witness, I guess, to our faith.
I think Jeff mentioned an article by Alvin Plantinga called Advice to Christian Philosophers. And reading that when I was an undergrad was really formative because it helped me to think more clearly about what that would look like. And I think it's going to look different in different disciplines. I mean, philosophy really allows you to get into the deeper questions right away. So it's in some ways maybe easier to see where that overlaps with Christianity. But I think when, if you have students or colleagues who are asking those kinds of questions to try to mentor them and to try to make those resources available. And if there aren't resources like that, to try to write them or to do presentations or panels, but to get that conversation going, because it's something that I benefited from a lot when I was undergrad and a grad student, just having the chance to think through this, controversial idea of being a Christian philosopher. It's that not everybody thinks there is such a thing. They could coexist. So, yeah.
I think it's a very difficult question, and like you, Brian, I feel like I've been the beneficiary of some excellent sort of mentorship or formation on this front. But I think to really achieve the goal that the questioner is asking about takes a wholesale institutional commitment. I feel like where I went to college, I was very grateful to be at the University of Dallas. Part of what I thought was distinctive about that is that they were very forthright about their emphasis on sort of broad liberal arts learning across a huge core curriculum of great texts. And they were very forthright about the fact that it's a Roman Catholic institution where students would be expected to study Christian theology with a view to the way in which, as they took it, Western civilization is sort of compounded by the classical tradition meeting the Christian heritage. And that resulted, I thought, in the impression that one got across various different disciplines, across different departments and different classes, that we were all engaged in sort of one comprehensive synthetic enterprise. And there was not an expectation that everyone agree or anything like that, but that your art history class, your politics class, your philosophy class, your theology class, your literature class, all of it was sort of part of or a facet of a whole. And it seems to me most universities don't even try to do that. Certainly the tradition in which I was brought up in the church was one that was not friendly to intellectual activity, not friendly to academic life. And I became, I think, the sort of scholar that I am because I was the beneficiary of an institution where that reconciliation or that synthetic viewpoint had been realized across the disciplinary divides in a way that I think is very rare and very difficult to find. And I think if we're going to really pull that off, it has to be done at the institutional level. I think Baylor University some years ago, tried to do something similar. I don't know of others, but I'm sure others may have examples in mind. But I think it's got to be something like a complete wholesale institutional commitment, ideally.
That would be very difficult because the reality is that the majority of academics don't live in that kind of institution anymore. Many academics actually live at a very secular public university or private. And so it is a big challenge, I think. Though definitely I agree with you, Jeff, that would be lovely, but I think it'd be very hard given the current environment and challenges.
Maybe now more than ever, we really need to make sure that as Christian academics that we are connecting with people not only within our respective fields who share our faith, even that, whatever that requires, which I know is something that the Center for Faith and Work is about, is like, connecting Christians within shared vocations in order to help them collaborate and to think through their vocation Christianly. And that would not only be subdiscipline, but also as academics, even as we're doing right now, incredibly important for me to read something from Francis about mathematics and how that connects to my faith, and it just expands my understanding. And or as Jeff talks about, the importance of having this kind of synthetic view is going to be harder the more fractured the university becomes, the more fragilized the modern world is. I do want to move on to the next question. We have a question from Daniel. What have you seen in each of your respective fields that encourages you in your pursuit of realizing God's kingdom in academia? What have you seen in each of your respective fields that encouraged you in your pursuit of realizing God's kingdom in academia? We do have another question coming in, so maybe one or two of you might want to talk about your respective field and how that has encouraged you in your pursuit of realizing God's kingdom. Yeah, just an encouragement within your field.
I've seen some evidence that para-university organizations, quasi-independent institutions are able to supplement some of the defects in modern university education, as well as provide support for like-minded students. I think there's a sort of growing trend to supply, say, additional learning opportunities, say in sort of independent study centers or institutes that are attached to universities, for students who are hungry for that kind of thing and who are interested in, say, a broader or deeper education, or an education that's less sort of secularized. I mean, I too work in exactly the kind of environment. Harvard is a secular institution at this point, obviously, although it was not founded that way naturally. But I think there are places in Cambridge where a person who was, say, enrolled at Harvard but was interested in exploring some of these topics more deeply could get advice as to which professors or which classes to take, could also meet with like-minded people and study the kinds of things that we've been talking about outside of the curriculum. But there will be a kind of informal kind of institutional support for people who are looking for this kind of thing. I think that's becoming increasingly available, and such organizations are able to be very agile and responsive to immediate student needs in ways that departments are not necessarily able to do. So I'm encouraged by that sort of thing.
Anybody else want to take a stab at that question? We have others if we're ready to move on. Okay, well, in the interest of time, I am going to bring up the next question. The question is, what intellectual trends and recent scholarship do you find most difficult to engage with as a Christian? or what kinds of ideas are in the air these days that may pose challenges to Christian thought and practice? And how then should we as Christian scholars approach these conversations? Very general question about very difficult, challenging ideas that are out there for Christians in the academy.
I guess I'll jump in. I think one academic trend over many years, not just recently, is the criticism that there is no objective truth. And while I'm sympathetic to the intent behind this view, I mean, there's this claim sort of requires nuance, right? I mean, I think what people are often saying when they talk about no objective truth is that there's subjectivity in how truths are presented. There's also the question of which truths get aired and which ones are not aired. And so there's a certain nuanced view of this, that saying that there's no objective truth is actually sort of hides. And so now we're sort of seeing, in a political age where truth is under attack, how those committed to this nuanced view of the subjectivity of truth is sort of caught in a quandary, right? Like I had somebody say to me recently, an academic say to me recently, who's not from a religious persuasion, say to me, all my academic life I've been talking about how there is no objective truth, and now I've sort of find myself taking the opposite view, in response to the misinformation that's going on around us. And so I guess I don't know if I have an easy answer to that question. It's something that I try not to wade into this, because having such a nuanced view is hard to communicate in a soundbite. And so I think, as Christians, we maybe have to think carefully about how we respect what people are bringing, but also try to communicate the nuance that's important to have.
I would second what Francis had to say about how truths are subjective and there's some subjectivity to it. I think that's a big challenge, and even in medicine, and that has direct implications for the practice of medicine in terms of truths and subjective truths specifically. That is difficult to argue and substantiate. As a scientist, I would also say that is problematic. It also leads down the road to what Francis brought up earlier about algorithm development. So part of my research relates to computational work. And it's a challenge in medicine as we begin to incorporate certain aspects of artificial intelligence and mechanisms of artificial intelligence to assist physicians and to assist the care of patients. But how do we wade through that? And how do we put that into the framework of Christianity and use our faith and our beliefs as we conduct those types of research and influence that kind of research? It's a challenge.
Yeah, I would say, in addition to the kind of things that my panelists have already identified, probably one of the big things working on the question of self and identity. I mean, just thinking, like, a lot of the most controversial topics right now are on the nature of identity, whether racial or gender identity, or all these different questions are probably the most voluble questions out there. And it's difficult to talk about them in such a way that's nuanced, because a lot of the time people are looking for a soundbite. They're looking for you just to kind of check the right box or wave the right flag to show that you're on the right side. And so it's easy to get kind of wrapped up into all the politics of that. And as a Christian, there are lots of things that I want to affirm, but a lot of things I really have real doubts about in kind of like the way that the identity politics thing is kind of framed. And so that's a very difficult topic to discuss in class, for sure.
We probably could have an entire session on the various challenges that are out there right now, but those have been two, I think, very important ones that have been brought up. And I want to give us one more question here. Our time is coming to a close, but we have one more question I want to bring to us. And the question is, this is a question about the craft and practice of scholarship. So that's kind of how it's been framed. And the person writes, I'm a junior faculty in a competitive field and institution. As you were going up for tenure and having to deal with the pressure of an unknown future, what aspect of God encouraged you to get through that process? So it's a very personal question of someone that is looking at tenure and knowing that there's a lot of pressure and maybe some unknown future in that. And maybe as a Christian going for tenure in an institution that may not be friendly is maybe if I read between the lines. So any final words of encouragement or thought for this junior faculty looking at this situation?
I'll take a stab at that since I have been in that position for the last year or so. I'd say it would go back to you've already been justified and saved by God. It really isn't your work per se that saves you, but your work is the fruit, and therefore all you can do is the best that you possibly can. And if you've used those gifts in a wise way, God may have other plans for you. So just because it did not work out does not mean that that there is anything personally wrong with you. And so I typically, or at least I use that as an encouragement every step of the way. For my work, a lot of my research is wholly dependent on grant funding from the federal government. And so every time there's a rejection on a big grant, I often pray and wonder, well, is this really what you want me to do? And that does come up, and it's helpful to put it in perspective.
I went on the job market in 2009, so it was the worst year in a long time. It was right after the recession and everything hit, and it hasn't improved, unfortunately. I mean, it's gotten better here and there, but it's still really difficult in philosophy and in a lot of fields. And I think for me, one of the most encouraging things was to try to step outside of the mindset, which is easy to acquire in the academy, that it's get a tenure track job and get tenure or bust. Like that, a lot of times in grad school, that's what you're trained to think of as success. Like you get a tenure track job, that's the dream, and then everything's great. And there are a lot of different ways to do good work in different fields, and not to feel like, it's that or nothing. And I think grad programs could do a better job of preparing grad students, because there aren't enough jobs for everyone, which is the sad reality. But there are there's work for everyone to do in different ways. So to see how God can lead in different directions as well, I think is important. So it's not just kind of like the winners and the losers, which is it's easy to feel that way.
I'll add just that for me, the practice of taking a Sabbath has been hugely important, even though it's been hard for me to do over the years. But it's a continual reminder that work is not the most important thing for me, and so just even if I don't take am not able to practice taking the Sabbath, just being regularly reminded that I should I think has been very important and helpful. And this is also, same goes for being in a Christian community. That can be a good reminder that my identity doesn't have to be completely in my work.
Well, I want to thank everybody who gave us some questions for our Q&A time, and I want to thank our panelists so much. I found this incredibly encouraging time together, so I really appreciate all of our panelists for taking their time out today to be with us for this special session of talking about faith in the academy. So thank you so much. I'm going to hand it over to Steve at this time.
That's great. Thank you, Robert. And thank you to our panelists. That was just an amazing dialogue with some such thoughtful leaders in the academy. Before I close us in prayer, I just wanted to let folks know that Center for Faith and Work Los Angeles has an upcoming annual Faith and Work conference. Like everyone else, we've shifted to online events, and that will be taking place the first week of April. Our theme is a very engaging topic and very relevant to trying to understand faith and work integration and our our own daily life, and how we interact with different institutions directly. We're going to be talking about the future of work and technology. So there'll be a lot of discussion around how technology has been shaping and influencing us, and how faith speaks into that very directly. So not just for those, obviously, that are working in technology fields, but also those who are just affected by technology, which we all are, probably today as much as any year, with all the technology surrounding online learning and interactions and social engagement. So we look forward to that. It will be very interactive, and I'll provide plenty of resources to you. It'll be a 3-part webinar series that first week of April. There'll also be a quick pop-up survey at the end of this webinar as soon as this closes. So please fill that out. It's so helpful to us for our planning for future sessions as well. So with that, I'm just going to close us in a prayer of blessing for all of those, especially present today, working in and around supporting the world of academics. Pray with me, please. Dear Lord of all truth and knowledge, make our colleges and universities be places promoting discovery of the goodness, truth, and beauty embedded in your creation, the virtues for living well in the world, and the methods that cultivate real flourishing and justice in all our social institutions. Bless these administrators, professors, students, and service staff to desire the best that higher education can bring. Diffuse the current climate of animosity to those that seek to follow you and live under your lordship as our great teacher and master. Give the leaders of these campuses represented here today humility, diligence, integrity, courage, and above all, love for the students they serve, keeping that as their central mission. We ask all this in the name of Jesus, our Lord and King. Amen. Thank you for being with us today. God bless.